Hi, my name is Tom, and we're going to do a quick test of whether or not paint with primer, which is regular paint, actually makes a difference on 3 different types of surfaces. We have unfinished drywall, we have drywall with 1 quick coat of primer, and we have drywall with 2 coats of primer on it. So I'm going to use 2 types of paint, paint with primer, and I'm going to do regular paint that does not have any advertised primer in it. For the cheap paint, we're going to use this PPG Multi-Pro Interior. It is the cheapest can of paint that I could find in a gallon size. It costs about 15 bucks from the Home Depot. And for the more expensive paint with primer, we're going to use the Behr Premium Plus. This is also from Home Depot, but I think this costs between 30 and 40 bucks, probably around 35 bucks a can. It also has low odor, but it's paint and primer, supposedly. We'll see if it makes a difference. This is the cheaper paint, the regular paint without primer, and we're going to go across the top with this. So it's been about 2 hours since I went ahead and I painted my walls. They're both dry to touch now. This is the paint without a primer. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but you can definitely still see the drywall beneath the first layer of paint. With the primed section, you can still see a little bit of light. Even in here, it didn't cover very well. It did cover it, but it didn't really cover it. It would need at least a second coat here. Here I can almost see a third coat, and on the section with 2 coats of primer, it's actually about the same. It looks a little different, but it's actually about the same coverage-wise than this. So 2 coats of primer versus 1 coat of primer doesn't really make much of a difference, but this stuff, you can still see a little bit of the white through here. Now, that's a cheap paint. With the more expensive paint with primer, it is a little different. Same idea here. 1 coat does not cover drywall. You will still need a second coat. It just didn't do much of a difference. In fact, if anything, this looks a tiny bit better on the drywall. But on the primed section, this is 1 layer of primer here. The paint with primer actually works pretty well. It's pretty solid. Again, it's hard to see on the camera, but this is actually pretty solid. I don't see any white through here. I might still put a 3rd coat, primer, paint on this, kind of go over it one more time, but it actually looks pretty good. Another thing it's hard to feel or kind of show is that this is powdery. It didn't actually dry. They're the same finish, they're both satins, but this dried a little, again, powdery for lack of a better term. The more expensive one, the more expensive paint with the primer in it actually dried much smoother. It's a much tighter weave or kind of a tighter paint coverage. It feels much nicer. And again, over here, with the 2 coats of primer, it didn't really make much of a difference. I can still see a little bit of the drywall primer through there. I'm still going to need to put a second coat on that just to kind of cover it up. So, is paint with no primer, dirt cheap paint with no primer, is that worth it? Or is it worth paying for the paint with primer in it? Now, they don't really have primer in it, just so you know. They just have some extra bits of chemicals, for lack of a better term, resins mostly, that actually help stick a little better. There are some other advantages to the more expensive paint as well. 1, feel. It actually feels a little different on there. 2, the coloring actually comes out a little different. Could just be a brand difference here with the coloring. There's lower odors. This actually does have a little bit of an odor to it. I'm not used to actually paint with any odor. This did not have much of an odor at all. And this might actually be more durable in the long run. So what would you do with these 6 different options? These paint with no primer, paint with primer, and different layers of primer? What I would typically recommend is 1 coat of primer, that's fine. And then no matter what paint you're going to use, you're still going to need to do probably 1.5 to 2 coats of paint on top of the primer to really get a good fill. Again, I was pretty fast with all of this, but the whole idea was to kind of zip through it and to kind of see what a quick coat actually did and what the difference is between these 2 types. So my recommendation would be to stick with a paint with primer going over 1 coat of regular primer on drywall. With wood and other substances, you may have different results. But with unpainted, unfinished drywall, you want to go ahead and do one coat of primer, and then you probably want to go ahead and use a better quality of paint, a paint with the primer in it. It really does cover it pretty well. If you like these sorts of videos where I go ahead and test different products and do little experiments, go ahead and like or subscribe or do whatever you do with the bell. That's fine, I appreciate it.